Robert, the case that you sent that I found particularly interesting is the class action lawsuit against Uber. Uber's facing a class action lawsuit because allegedly failing to ensure that their drivers are sufficiently vetted, failing to protect the well-being of their users. And I didn't know this. There were 1,000 cases of some form of assault, varying degrees of severity, up from the lesser degrees of severity to the severest. 1,000 cases in 2020 alone. And I've only discovered Uber, as you know, Robert, in Vegas. I've never had the Uber app on my phone. And I had these questions. How do they vet the people? How do they make sure that the drivers are good? How do they make sure that the pickups are good? I figured it would be safer than taxi riding. I think it's probably safer for the driver, but not necessarily for the user now. 1,000 cases of some form of sexual assault in 2020. And what is alleged in the lawsuit, you know more than me. They were not doing background checks. They were not requiring fingerprints. They were basically, for the sake of growth, allowing anyone and everyone to drive an Uber, which resulted in some serious problems. Do you know more details of the overall context to Uber as a business?
So there's been the Uber files. So a lot of leaked information has been released about how Uber corrupted a lot of governing officials all around the globe, including in Italy, but not limited to there, all over the place. And what Uber set out to do is to pretend that they were an app, that they were not a taxi service. That's why they refused to register as a taxi service. That's why they got into major litigation about whether they had to provide workers' comp or they had to provide employee compensation or whether they could treat them as 1099 instead of W-2 employees. So they marketed themselves as better than a taxi, but internally treated themselves as not at all like a taxi. And as part of that process, clearly imposed no meaningful limitations or restrictions in the training and hiring process. So usually when assault cases arise, they're really tough to prove because courts don't like to hold employers responsible for the intentional torts of their employees or their contractors. But over time, they've allowed negligent hiring, negligent retention, and it can happen in landlord context, things like that. That there's something, if you did something that could have easily prevented the injury from occurring, they've increasingly held you more responsible for it. And so Uber was clearly, basically, if you were a rapist, no better opportunity than become an Uber driver. They should have put that ad up. Because that was effectively how they were functioning. And they were putting people with clear documented records of sexual assault in a position to drive and pick up young women without notice of the risk to those young women. And many of them became victims consequently. And so that's what they got exposed for. And you combine the Uber leaks, the Uber files leaks with this suit kind of following up on that. You can see that Uber's in some legal trouble because of their pernicious behavior.
And someone in the chat rightly said, 1,000 assaults in however many rides, but it doesn't really work like that because if you can attribute negligence to even the 1,000 cases in let's say the hundreds of millions of rides, it's a problem. And for them to not be doing sufficient background checks for the sake of growth and allowing anyone, I had the question. I guarantee that Uber is safer for the rider, but more risky for the passenger. A taxi driver, exceptions aside, is not going to do anything. They have a medallion. They've had their certification. They're not going to do anything.
Incidents have happened, but taxi companies have long imposed these background check requirements for the most part, whereas Uber just didn't, because Uber wanted to pretend. Uber didn't want the responsibility. Uber wanted the money. And so that's why Uber did what they did. And they did this in many contexts, and this is just one of the more egregious ones. And they figured out their way to get approval without meeting the regular standards was just to bribe a lot of people, which is what the Uber files and the Uber leaks fully disclose and divulge. So now I don't know if it's as bad as getting some toxic Skittles